In the winter of 1983, residents along the bluffs of Pacifica, California, watched in horror as the very ground beneath their homes began to dissolve. One witness described the sound of cliffs giving way as homes were pulled into the abyss of the Pacific. Others reported seeing backyard fences and entire patios dangling over 80-foot drops. These were the catastrophic results of building real estate in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, eroding cliffs. As images of this mess spread, the world was left to wonder, how did a modern suburban dream turn into such a literal cliffhanger? Stay tuned to find out as we explore the rise and fall of Pacifica, California. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Now, before we discuss why parts of this California town are eroding into the sea, I'd like to explain why anyone would build a settlement here in the first place. The story begins on the north bank of San Pedro Creek, at its strategic junction with the Pacific. This land was inhabited by Native Americans for centuries, and they maintained a close relationship with the coast as a hunting ground. However, things in the area would change with the arrival of a Spanish expedition in late 1769. From October the 31st to November 3rd of that year, the Spanish explorers documented the region. The account recalls a world of grizzly bears, brutally dangerous terrain, and sophisticated indigenous architecture. And this documentation was crucial, as it's one of the earliest records of what was there. Anyhow, by 1785, the Spanish presence shifted from exploration to an agricultural engine, with outposts featuring permanent structures such as chapels, granaries, and a central plaza. Though ultimately, the focus shifted to cattle ranching before the agricultural efforts fell apart and the entire network was abandoned in 1834. Even so, Europeans had demonstrated that the region had potential, and it wouldn't be long before others followed suit. Between 1842 and 1846, Commander Francisco Sanchez constructed his adobe residence on a massive 9,000-acre land grant known as Rancho San Pedro. Some reports suggest that Sanchez utilized recycled material from the granary and the chapel of the abandoned settlement to build his home. In doing so, he created what some historians consider the finest example of Monterey colonial-style architecture. And that symbolic merit mattered. It transformed the region's future. This famous adobe served as headquarters for the massive land grant, which encompassed nearly all of modern-day northwestern San Mateo County. And because the ranch was a managed, centralized property, its specific geography dictated where future infrastructure would eventually go. Fast forward to the arrival of the Ocean Shore Railroad in the early 1900s, and the building blocks for a city along the coast were in place. This new rail connection had promised to turn this coastline into a terrace by the sea. Passengers would travel south from San Francisco, looking out windows at station names that today's locals still recognize. By the 1930s, the early rail line was gone, but early roadways continued to connect the region to San Francisco. And as automobiles improved, weekend cabins eventually turned into permanent residences. One visitor in particular, architect Alistair Mackenzie, once visited Salada Beach and envisioned a dream. Mackenzie believed in, quote, the extraordinary influence on health of pleasurable excitement, influences made possible by the land's mystic-like beauty. Others felt the same, and it wouldn't be long before artichoke farmers were eventually joined by seasonal residents escaping the city. Another population boom followed after World War II, as demand for affordable housing for veterans spurred rapid development, straining local infrastructure in the process. Ultimately, the various coastal neighborhoods chose to incorporate to prevent annexation by nearby municipalities. And just like that, Pacifica was born, independent city in 1957. And it should be noted here that even back then, the city's new borders ignored a looming geographical reality. The reality that the Pacific Ocean itself was already planning their eviction. The San Francisco Peninsula is a fragile needle of land defined by the churn of the ocean to the west and the bay to the east. So it's an understatement to say that placing a city here was a bold experiment. Foundations are on shifting sands. And here's the crazy thing, urban planners knew it from the start. As early as 1892, the U.S. Geological Survey conducted a study that classified the area as unstable. further explaining how it was, quote, a dangerous location of brackish lagoons. Yet no one wanted to listen, and uncontrollable development set in. In short, the idea of Pacifica, a scenic, lower-priced bedroom community, overrode the geological warnings, of which there were many. The plan was simple: convert the artichoke farms and dunes into suburbs. And at this point, the 1960s expansion was pushing into some very illogical cliffside areas. But still, it didn't matter. Nearby highway expansion amplified the problem, making the concept of this community that much more appealing to commuters from the city. And so, as the town filled in, developers became more willing to grade the high-risk hills and cliffs for real estate investments. All the same, by the 1970s, that phase of unbridled growth had slowed. The community began to realize that they had placed their critical infrastructure on precarious, unstable ground. This awareness was triggered by a series of catastrophic winters, notably 1978, which proved that the town's marine terrace geology, essentially loosely packed seafloor, was no match for the Pacific's might. First symptoms were subtle, but let me paint the clear picture. We're talking about things like the sight of backyard fences dangling over 80-foot drops, massive unexplainable cracks in the pavement, and so on. In other words, the reality was finally illustrated in a way that no one could ignore. In response, a powerful grassroots movement emerged to halt further expansion, eventually leading to the formation of the Pacific Land Trust. This marked the first organized effort to pull vulnerable land off the private market to protect the city's unique coastal habitat from further encroachment. The trust suggested that rather than viewing the coastline as a site for more housing, the community could see it as a fragile resource that required permanent protection to prevent disaster. And so the town wasn't fighting to build, it was fighting to save itself from the nature beneath it. Nevertheless, these measures were too little, too late. The first major disaster struck in January of 1982, when a 1,000-year storm turned the Pacific ridges into a trap. After 30 hours of relentless rain, the saturated hillsides of the Lindamar district liquefied. Not long after, a massive mudslide thundered down the canyon, burying a family home and sadly claiming the lives of 3 children. It was a localized tragedy, yes, but the disturbing character of the images that it left behind impacted onlookers across the globe. In Pacifica, the danger wasn't just in front of you at the ocean, it was also above you in the mountains. And as if that's not bad enough, just a year later in 1983, a historic El Niño hit. As record-breaking high tides hammered the coast, the toothpaste-like geology of the marine terraces finally gave way. On the bluffs, residents watched in horror as their backyards and then the foundations of their homes vanished into the sea. National news crews captured the surreal sight of mobile homes and clifftop houses teetering over 80-foot drops. By the time the storm subsided, more than 10 homes were gone, and the neighborhood itself was little more than a jagged scar of broken cement. But it doesn't end there. The decade closed with one final blow: the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. Though the epicenter was miles away, the 6.9 magnitude tremor caused the already weakened cliffs to slump, compromising the buildings along Palmetto Avenue. Hence, by the 1990s, the suburban dream was far gone. Pacifica entered a permanent state of emergency, and somehow the worst was yet to come. The 1990s were a decade of desperate fortification. The city poured millions into armoring the coast, lining the base of the bluffs with massive boulders and a concrete seawall. But the measures were taken in vain. After the destabilizing effects of the earthquake, the city's steep coastal bluffs and hillsides became increasingly fragile, and the situation would not improve. Winter storms in the mid-1990s saturated the soil, triggering landslides that crept towards homes and forced evacuations. But the most dramatic destruction came during the storms of '98, when relentless waves and rain combined to erode entire sections of the coastline. Entire apartment buildings along the oceanfront, especially on the Esplanade, were at risk of falling into the sea. In fact, some structures had to be condemned and demolished before they could fall, while others were damaged beyond repair as the ground shifted under them. Over the decade, these disasters weren't isolated, but a continuous process of erosion and collapse. By the early 2000s, homes in hillside neighborhoods such as Fairway Park also began to crack and tilt as landslide zones reactivated during wet winters, forcing even more evacuations and, in some cases, permanent abandonment. Coastal erosion also intensified along the bluffs, where protective structures struggled to hold back the ocean. Perhaps the most intense destruction came during the severe winter storms of 2009 to 2010, when heavy rains and powerful surf combined to accelerate cliff retreat. This is when an almost apocalyptic-looking amount of apartments were placed dangerously close to the edge, prompting emergency responses, red tagging, and demolitions before anything could slide into the sea. So it's safe to say that from 2010 to present, Pacifica has endured a continuous cycle of damage, evacuation, and demolition. Hillside neighborhoods, especially in the slide zone, have also experienced repeated ground movements during wet winters, where homes slowly warped, split apart, and were ultimately condemned. And it's not just real estate in danger. In 2016, a massive sinkhole opened and a large section of the coastal trail collapsed, further shifting the narrative from rich people's houses are falling to the city's infrastructure and public parks are now disappearing. The notion was only amplified a year later when the Pacific Pier took on massive damage, and the city had to spend millions to construct an emergency riprap in the hope of saving the beach boulevards and sidewalk. This was a battle for the heart of the town, as the pier is basically the city's only landmark. Finally, the extreme atmospheric river storms of 2022 to 23 accelerated cliff erosion to alarming levels, leaving behind unthinkable wreckage and very disturbing imagery. Since that time, additional oceanfront apartments have been demolished, with some structures having come within feet of collapse before the removal. And the list goes on. Roads, utilities, and protective seawalls were repeatedly damaged or undermined, which is all to say that it's becoming abundantly clear that this type of fight with Mother Nature probably can't be won. And that is why Pacifica California is falling into the sea. I really hope you liked the episode, and if you did, please consider supporting our work by watching one of the videos on screen here. Otherwise, until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.